In February 2026, the United States and Iran held their first direct diplomatic talks in years. The meetings were quiet, held in neutral territory, described as progress, a potential de-escalation after months of tension in the Persian Gulf. American officials were cautiously optimistic. Iranian diplomats were cooperative. Both sides discussed reducing military presence, opening communication channels, preventing the kind of near-miss incidents that had almost triggered war weeks earlier. It looked like diplomacy working, like adults choosing dialogue over conflict. But while American and Iranian officials sat in conference rooms discussing peace, Iran was moving its most advanced ballistic missiles across the region, using a fleet of unmarked cargo ships, ghost vessels with false identities, sailing through waters the U.S. Navy was supposed to control, and American intelligence didn't notice until it was too late. If you're fascinated by the invisible games superpowers play and the deceptions that shape modern warfare, subscribe to A Disturbed Historian. We're covering the conflicts fought in shadows while diplomats smile for cameras. The talks began on February 3rd in Oman, neutral ground. Both sides sent mid-level officials. Not dramatic, not a summit. Just quiet discussions about reducing tensions. The U.S. wanted assurances that Iran wouldn't attack commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran wanted guarantees that American carrier groups would maintain certain distances from Iranian waters. Both wanted to avoid another crisis like the one in January when the USS Abraham Lincoln had crossed invisible red lines and both militaries went to launch-ready status. The talks were functional, professional. They agreed to continue meeting, to establish hotlines for emergency communication, to coordinate naval movements to prevent accidents. American officials briefed the press that progress was being made, that Iran seemed genuinely interested in de-escalation. They were lying, or rather, Iran's diplomats were executing a strategy their military had designed specifically for this moment. The talks weren't about peace. They were cover, a distraction. While American intelligence focused on the diplomatic track, monitoring for signs of Iranian sincerity or deception in the negotiating rooms, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was executing one of the most sophisticated weapons smuggling operations in modern history. They were moving advanced ballistic missiles, the kind that could strike Israel, Saudi Arabia, or American bases across the Middle East, from Iran to positions in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and they were doing it using commercial cargo ships that had been carefully prepared to avoid detection. The operation was called, at least according to later intelligence assessments, the Ghost Fleet. Iran had purchased or leased approximately 20 cargo vessels over the previous year. These weren't military ships. They were commercial freighters, registered in countries with loose oversight: Panama, Liberia, Marshall Islands. Flag of convenience registries that ask few questions and maintain minimal records. The ships had legitimate commercial histories. They'd transported grain, construction materials, consumer goods. They looked on paper and to satellite observation like normal cargo vessels operating in the Gulf and Red Sea. But Iran had modified them. Not obviously. No visible weapons, no military markings. The modifications were internal. Reinforced cargo holds that could handle the weight of ballistic missiles, concealed loading equipment, false manifests and documentation systems, communication equipment that could receive encrypted orders. These ships could transport missiles while appearing to carry normal cargo, and they could operate in international waters, in commercial shipping lanes, mixed with thousands of other vessels, completely invisible to anyone not looking very carefully. The missiles being moved were Iranian-made, variants of Russian and North Korean designs, medium-range ballistic missiles, with ranges between 500 and 2,000 kilometers, capable of carrying conventional or potentially chemical warheads, not nuclear. Iran doesn't have confirmed nuclear weapons yet. but devastating nonetheless. These missiles could strike targets across the Middle East, could overwhelm missile defense systems through sheer numbers, could change the strategic balance in multiple conflicts. And Iran was moving them out of the country, where American or Israeli strikes could destroy them, and positioning them in allied territories where they'd be much harder to target. The timing was perfect. The diplomatic talks created a window. American surveillance assets were focused on monitoring Iran's compliance with whatever verbal commitments were being made in Oman. Satellites watched known missile facilities. Signals intelligence listened to Iranian military communications. Analysts studied Iranian naval movements near the Strait of Hormuz. All the usual indicators of Iranian military activity. But nobody was watching random cargo ships with Panamanian registry sailing from Iranian ports to Iraq or Syria. Those ships were civilian traffic. Background noise. Exactly what Iran was counting on. The ships moved in groups of 2 or 3, never all together, spaced out over weeks, each carrying components for mobile missile launches. The missiles themselves were transported disassembled. Easier to conceal, easier to explain if inspected, just industrial equipment. Rocket bodies could be described as industrial tanks or pipes, guidance systems as electronics, fuel as chemicals for manufacturing. And because these were flagged as commercial vessels from neutral countries, boarding and inspecting them would have been diplomatically complicated. The US Navy can't just seize random cargo ships in international waters without serious justification. Some of the ships docked in Iraqi ports. Iraq officially opposes Iranian military presence, but Iran has significant influence over Iraqi militias and political factions. The cargo was offloaded quietly, transported by truck to militia-controlled areas in western Iraq. Other ships sailed to Syria, where Iranian forces have been operating since the Syrian civil war began. Assad's government welcomed the shipments, needed Iranian support to maintain power, didn't ask questions about cargo that arrived on unmarked freighters. A few ships even made it to Yemen, to Houthi-controlled ports on the Red Sea coast, delivering missiles to one of Iran's most effective proxy forces. American intelligence discovered the operation on February 18th, 2 weeks into the diplomatic talks. A satellite image analyst noticed something odd. A cargo ship that had left an Iranian port 10 days earlier was being unloaded in Syria. The ship's manifest said it was carrying construction equipment, but the containers being moved looked wrong. Too heavy for the cranes being used, handled too carefully. The analyst flagged it. More analysts looked. They traced the ship's movements, checked other vessels with similar registration patterns, and they realized what was happening. The reaction was immediate and classified. American officials didn't announce the discovery publicly, didn't confront Iranian diplomats in Oman. Instead, they began tracking every ship that fit the pattern. Retrospective satellite analysis, signals intelligence intercepts, human intelligence from assets in Iraq and Syria. And they discovered that Iran had already moved significant quantities of missiles and launchers, dozens of systems, positioned across multiple countries, ready to be assembled and deployed. The strategic implications were enormous. Iran had just changed the regional military balance without firing a shot. Those missiles in Iraq could strike Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia from Iraqi territory. Israel could retaliate against Iran, but the missiles would be launching from Iraq. That would drag Iraq into any conflict, create political chaos, force the US to choose between defending Israel and maintaining relationships with Iraq's government. The missiles in Syria similarly complicated Israeli defense planning. Syria's air defenses, backed by Russian systems, made strikes riskier, and the missiles in Yemen gave the Houthis capability to strike ships in the Red Sea or targets in Saudi Arabia more effectively. The Americans faced a choice: expose the operation publicly and embarrass Iran. This would kill the diplomatic talks, prove Iran was negotiating in bad faith, but it would also reveal that American intelligence had missed the operation while it was happening, make the US look incompetent, Alternatively, continue the talks while quietly working to neutralize the missiles. Use special operations, covert strikes, sabotage, but that risked starting a war if operations failed or were exposed, or accept the new reality. The missiles were positioned. Removing them would be difficult and risky. Maybe deterrence still worked. Maybe the important thing was preventing Iran from using them rather than removing them. The decision, at least based on what's been reported, was a middle approach. The talks continued. American diplomats didn't reveal they knew about the missiles. But behind the scenes, intelligence sharing with Israel and Saudi Arabia intensified. Special operations forces began planning raids. Cyber warfare units looked for ways to disable the missiles remotely. And the U.S. quietly increased its own missile defense deployments in the region. More Patriot batteries, more THAAD systems, more assets positioned to intercept Iranian missiles if they launched. Iran, meanwhile, knew the Americans would eventually figure it out. The operation wasn't designed to be permanent secret. It was designed to be completed before being discovered, and it had worked. By the time American intelligence understood what happened, the missiles were in place, dispersed, hidden among militia, forces, or Syrian military units. Removing them would require extensive military operations, potentially triggering the wider war both sides claimed they wanted to avoid. The Ghost Fleet operation revealed several disturbing realities about modern conflict. First, that diplomatic talks can be weaponized, used not just to resolve disputes, but to create windows for military operations. Iran had calculated that initiating talks would reduce American vigilance, that the U.S. would interpret diplomatic engagement as evidence of Iranian reasonableness. And they were right. American surveillance focused on traditional military indicators, missed the commercial shipping operation happening in plain sight. Second, that the distinction between military and civilian infrastructure is increasingly meaningless. Those cargo ships were civilian vessels, registered commercially, operating in international waters. But they were transporting weapons, serving military objectives, yet treating them as military targets would have been legally and diplomatically complicated. Iran exploited that gray zone, used civilian cover for military operations, and created situations where American response options were all problematic. Third, that proxy warfare has reached new levels of sophistication. Iran didn't just move missiles to Iranian-controlled territory. They moved them to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, countries where other actors officially govern but where Iranian proxies have significant presence. This creates plausible deniability. If those missiles are used, Iran can claim Iraqi militias or Hezbollah or Houthis operated independently. That Iran didn't order the strikes can't be held responsible. Meanwhile, Iran gains strategic depth. Their missiles aren't just in Iran anymore. They're distributed across the region. Harder to destroy, harder to deter. The diplomatic talks continued through February into March. Both sides maintained the pretense. American officials never publicly acknowledged the missile operation. Iranian officials never admitted it. The talks produced minor agreements. Hotlines were established. Communication protocols agreed upon. Both sides claimed progress, pointed to reduced tensions, and technically there had been progress. Direct communication channels existed now, mechanisms to prevent accidental escalation. But the fundamental reality had changed. Iran had demonstrated they could move advanced weapons under American surveillance, could use diplomacy as cover for military operations, could outmaneuver the world's most sophisticated intelligence apparatus. For American military planners, the lesson was bitter. You can have the best satellites, the best signals intelligence, the best analysts. But if you're looking in the wrong places, at the wrong things, you'll miss what matters. The U.S. had been watching for Iranian missile tests, for military exercises, for overt aggressive moves. They weren't watching Panamanian-flagged cargo ships. weren't tracking commercial vessels with suspicious loading patterns. Iran had identified the blind spot and exploited it perfectly. For Iran, the operation was a strategic victory. They'd positioned advanced weapons, strengthened their proxies, demonstrated capability, and they'd done it while engaged in peace talks with the United States. The message was clear. Iran can negotiate and fight simultaneously, can smile in conference rooms while moving weapons in shadows, can play the diplomatic game while never stopping the military competition. That's useful deterrence, makes adversaries uncertain. If Iran can deceive this effectively during talks they initiated, what else are they doing? What other operations are running that haven't been discovered yet? The Ghost Fleet operation also revealed something about the nature of modern warfare. The most effective attacks don't always look like attacks. They look like normal activity, commercial shipping, diplomatic engagement, routine operations, until you realize the shipping was moving weapons. The diplomacy was cover, the routine was camouflage. This is how conflicts are fought now, not primarily through open battle, but through deception, through exploiting the gaps between military and civilian, between war and peace, through creating situations where your adversary can't respond without escalating, beyond what's proportional or acceptable. The missiles Iran moved are still out there, positioned in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. Some have probably been assembled into operational systems. Others remain in storage, ready to be deployed quickly if needed. Israel knows they're there, worries about them constantly. Saudi Arabia is aware, has increased its own defenses. The United States tracks them as best it can, plans for scenarios where they might be used. But removing them would require operations that could start wars. So they stay, a new fact on the ground, a new piece of the strategic puzzle. And the talks. They ended in late March. Both sides declared them successful, claimed they'd reduced tensions and improved communication. Didn't mention the missiles, didn't acknowledge that one side had spent the entire negotiation period moving weapons while the other side failed to notice until too late. The official narrative was diplomatic progress. The reality was Iran executing a sophisticated military operation under cover of that progress. This is modern conflict, not armies clashing, not declarations of war, just quiet moves, ghost ships carrying weapons, diplomats talking peace while militaries prepare for war, intelligence services trying to track operations designed specifically to avoid detection, and everyone maintaining plausible deniability. Iran didn't move missiles. Those were commercial shipments. The talks were genuine. Just because military operations continued doesn't mean diplomacy was insincere. The US didn't miss anything. They knew all along and chose not to react. All of it is lies. All of it is partially true. That's the new reality. Conflicts where everyone is playing multiple games simultaneously, where peace talks and weapons smuggling happen in parallel, where cargo ships are weapons platforms, where diplomatic progress masks military positioning, where the truth is classified and the public narrative is curated, and what actually happened might not be clear for years. The Ghost Fleet operation worked. Iran moved missiles, positioned them strategically, did it under American surveillance, used diplomacy as cover, exploited gaps in monitoring, demonstrated capability and deception. And they got away with it. Not in the sense that nobody knows. American intelligence knows. Israeli intelligence knows. But in the sense that those missiles are still there, still operational, still a threat. And removing them is harder than preventing them from being moved in the first place. That's the lesson. Prevention is easier than remediation. Seeing operations while they're happening is better than discovering them afterward. But prevention requires looking everywhere, trusting nothing, assuming every cargo ship might be carrying weapons, every diplomatic talk might be cover, every routine operation might be camouflage. That level of paranoia is exhausting, expensive, creates false positives and wastes resources. But the alternative is missing operations like Ghost Fleet, waking up to discover your adversary, has changed the strategic balance. While you were watching the wrong things, the United States and Iran aren't at war. Not officially, but they're not at peace either. They're in a state of permanent competition, each side probing for weaknesses, testing capabilities, looking for advantages. The Ghost Fleet operation was one move in an ongoing game. Iran scored, demonstrated they can deceive effectively, can operate under American surveillance, can use diplomacy as weapon, rather than just as conflict resolution tool. What's the next move? Unknown. The US might try covert operations against the missiles, might increase regional military presence, might develop new surveillance capabilities to prevent future ghost fleets. Iran might attempt similar operations with different systems, might use the success to plan even bolder moves, or both sides might quietly agree that this is the new normal. Missiles are positioned, everyone knows where. Deterrence is adjusted accordingly. Life goes on until it doesn't. The talks were a trap, not in the sense that Iran never intended to negotiate. Maybe they did. Maybe the talks had dual purposes. Create communication channels and provide cover for weapons movement. Both can be true, but calling them just diplomacy misses half the story. Misses that while diplomats talked, cargo ships sailed. While analysts monitored Iranian military bases, Ghost Fleet ships loaded missiles. While everyone focused on whether Iran was negotiating in good faith, Iran was executing military operations that changed regional power dynamics. That's the disturbing part. Not that Iran moved missiles. Countries move weapons constantly, but that they did it during peace talks, used diplomacy as operational cover, calculated that American intelligence would have blind spots and exploited them, succeeded, and did all of it without consequences. The talks ended amicably. No confrontation over the deception. No punishment, just quiet acknowledgement that Iran had outplayed American intelligence, and adjustment to the new reality Iran had created. The Ghost Fleet sails, maybe literally. Those ships are still out there, operating commercially, carrying legitimate cargo until they're needed again, until Iran decides to move more weapons, or different weapons, or personnel, or whatever the next operation requires. The infrastructure exists, the capability is proven. The playbook is written, and the United States knows that commercial shipping in the Gulf and Red Sea might be more than it seems, that any cargo ship could be a weapons platform, that civilian cover is effective camouflage, that watching everything is impossible, that Iran can and will exploit that impossibility. Welcome to modern warfare, where the battles are fought in shipping manifests and satellite, images and diplomatic conference rooms, where deception is more valuable than firepower, where the side that moves unseen wins, where peace talks might be traps, where cargo ships might carry missiles, where nothing is what it appears, and everyone pretends otherwise until the missiles launch, until the deception is revealed, until the trap springs. And by then, it's too late to prevent, only to react. And reaction is always more costly than prevention. Always less effective, always playing catch-up to an adversary who planned better, moved smarter, deceived more effectively. Iran fooled the US Navy, used talks as a trap, moved secret missiles via Ghost Fleet, and got away with it. That's not speculation. That's what happened. February 2026, while diplomats smiled and talked progress, while analysts watched Iranian bases, while the world thought tensions were decreasing. Iran was changing the game, moving pieces, positioning threats, and nobody stopped them, because nobody saw them until it was too late.